Hello, here in this video we're going to talk about step 1. Step 1 is about identifying challenges. This is the first step in the problem-solving process. It does have some bearing on how your booklet will proceed from there, so there are some things that we'll want to look out for, but mainly this is a standalone section to where we'll just be focusing on one specific task and trying to do that task well. So we can see here up at the top in bold, the key objective in step 1 is to identify challenges based on the future scene. A challenge is an issue, concern, or problem in the future scene that needs attention or consideration. So points of importance. Your goal is 16 well-written challenges that encompass the 18 categories as best as we can. And we'll see here in a moment when I scroll over to the grading section how many challenges and categories you need to hit to get full credit. So in step 1, challenges are written in statement form. Questions are inappropriate for this step, which means if you have any question marks on this, that's no good. So state challenges in terms of possibilities. Challenges are stated with possible terms such as may, might, could, etc. If you say will, you get credit for the first 4. But then after that, anytime that you say will, you'll no longer receive credit for that challenge. It's important to write challenges in a cause and effect style. You must establish both. Here are some sample problems, and you can imagine what type of future scene this would be based from. This is just a general, Antarctica is having issues with oil and pollutants. So, since the ships that bring people and supplies to Antarctica leak fuel or oil, they could harm many of the animals living in the waters surrounding Antarctica. If we break down this sample problem, you'll see a couple things. First off, you'll see the cause. The ships are leaking fuel or oil, and then there's an effect. They could harm the animals in the surrounding area. Now, also notice that they correctly used a word such as may, might, or could. So there are the important components of getting a problem written correctly. Now, also hidden in this, which we'll see over here on this other side when we talk about the categories, this one, with the waters surrounding Antarctica, this one would be tied to the environment. And we'll see what types of categories are over off to the side here soon. The next one, since sea animals living in the water surrounding Antarctica like krill are harmed by oil spills, then there might be a disruption in the food chain of the animals living near Antarctica, which could result in endangerment or even extinction. So once again, here in this problem, we'll see some of the important components. You'll see the word could, or may or might, which they could have used as well. And then they also set up a cause and effect. The cause, since sea animals living in the water, like krill, are harmed by oil spills. So here's a cause. There might be disruption in the food chain. And then an effect which could result in endangerment or even extinction. Now this problem is also going to essentially tie back to environment, which is both of these, and you can see are slightly similar in terms of what they're accomplishing. Both tie back to the environment. So we'll be working and practicing to make sure that we write problems that are tied to other types of things. An example that could be tied to another category could be something along the lines of, due to the fact that ships are leaking oil in Antarctica, it diminishes the beauty of the environment, which then reduces Antarctica's tourist population. Because in the future, touring Antarctica could very well be a thing, so it's always appropriate to tie in future things that could be occurring. And then that could tie back to business and commerce. And you could think through this situation, which I didn't give you a future scene on, which tells the whole narrative. But maybe the future scene narrative there's some sort of business that now operates on Antarctica in the future, and they're trying to use the tourism to help preserve Antarctica. And so a decline in business and commerce could cause that company to fail, thus leaving Antarctica to suffer the fates of uncontrolled climate deterioration. When you're creating challenges, even ones for an imaginary future scene that you didn't read, there's always plenty of opportunities to, speculate and make up whatever type of future events that you might want. The goals. You say what the challenge is, why it is a challenge, and then either explicitly or passively, you need to talk about how it logically relates to the future scene. And a lot of times that'll just happen naturally as you're establishing the cause and effect, but sometimes you can even go more specifically to tie it into your future scene, and we'll get practice on that as we create some in practice together. So here's what it looks like on the grading portion of the documents, and I gave you some of the highlights. To get the highest score, you need to have 14 well-written problems to earn full credit, which means 2 of them you can drop and still earn the full credit. This flexibility is how many categories you have to hit, and you only need to hit 11 to get the maximum, which means some of your problems can reuse the same components. Like here, both of these relate to environment, so as long as they're different enough to not be considered duplicates of one another, they could contribute to the 14 to 16 properly written problems for you to get the full credit. So you don't have to hit all the categories. You can just hit a minimum of 11 and still get the full credit. Clarity is determined from your strength of writing, how you establish cause and effect. Starting each challenge with the word since is easiest because it allows you to jump right into that cause and effect, but it doesn't enhance the sophistication of your problems to get a 7 or 8 on the clarity grade component. So sometimes you might start off all of your problems with the word since, and then maybe go through and change some of the wording to help give you a better sophistication on your wording. Here are the categories which you can use as a lens to view the future scene that you'll read to help identify the different challenges. Because when you're staring at a blank booklet, it can be hard to come up with, 16 or even the 14 well-written problems that you need to get the maximum amount of points. But if you view the future scene through these categories, that can help you hone in on some of the different characteristics. Depending on the future scenes, some are a little more difficult than others. You do have to keep in mind, though, that you can project some of the ways that the future will transpire and use that to your advantage. So it doesn't have to just be limited to the things that are currently possible. For example, in this one where the problems addressed issues with Antarctica, if we're looking at recreation, it's like, well, currently no one does anything on Antarctica, but in the future that might not be the case, and you could just say that, recreational activities like, and then make something up like Snow Dome year 2055, could suffer if tourism declines, something like that. So you can work in these categories in unique ways that address possible physical manifestations of what's going to happen in the future. For something like law and justice, you could talk about how Antarctica isn't owned by anyone, and so trying to police it and control the amount of contamination that's occurring there could be in issues with law and justice because there's not one nation in charge of policing it. And so that might have been a challenge that you wouldn't have otherwise thought until you took a chance to think about, well, how would law and justice apply to the concept of Antarctica having oil spills and that running into sorts of issues as related to Antarctica. So that's what having these categories memorized can be helpful to do, is it'll really allow you to generate some problems without having to think for an extremely long amount of time, because this first portion of the booklet, the problems, will need to get done in a rather quick, timely fashion so that you can spend the majority on the book, doing what actual future problem solving is, which is solving a key problem that we'll talk about in the next step.